Marwil?
Yes, now can you hear me? I cannot believe 1 year after the pandemic and I still start muting myself. So we are back online with the ordinary session E. We will have 3 presentations. The topic of the session is structural change, export-led growth, and the Sraffian Supermultiplier. So first, Alberto Botta from the University of Greenwich will present structural change, productive development, and international capital flows. Does financial bonanza cause premature de-industrialization? Later on, Ledson de Rosa from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro will present the stock and flow consistent approach of the Sraffian Supermultiplier with inventories. And finally, I will conclude with a song of ice and fire, competitiveness in an export-led growth economy. So we will have 25 minutes each presentation. Alberto Botta, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you a lot, Marwil. Thanks a lot to the organizer of the workshop for having us presenting this paper. This paper is a joint work, is the result of a joint research together with Giuliano Toshiro Yajima from University of Rome La Sapienza and Gabriel Porsile from ICLAC. What I'm gonna present is a paper taken from a wider research. The title of that wider research is Productive Development, Structural Change and International Capital Flows, trying to understand the role of macroprudential policy for structural change and a transformative post-COVID recovery. From that wider research, we took the paper with the title mentioned before by Marwil, and here, in a sense, is the outline of the presentation, the outline of the broader research, but also the outline of the paper I'm going to present today. So first of all, I will say a few words about the relation between productive development and the economic implications of COVID-19. This is important because apparently countries presenting a weaker productive structure, a less diversified productive structure, suffered the most from the spread of COVID. In order to tackle the problems of COVID and to give rise to a sustained and sustainable recovery from COVID-19, it is important to analyze which are the sources of a backward productive structure, to understand which are the sources of persistent productive underdevelopment. And in this paper, we try to analyze the role of large capital flows, of periods of capital bonanza, as a potential source of premature industrialization. And in particular, we will put attention on the role of portfolio investments and international credit, the most volatile sources of capital flows, which has been frequently related to macroeconomic instability. But there is many more things to say about their possible effect also on the long-run trajectory of countries in terms of affecting the productive structure of countries. And after that, we will come to the policy implications of our paper, trying to analyze whether external macroprudential policy, or the so-called capital and flow management policies, could play a role not only in stabilizing the macroeconomy of developing countries in particular, but also feeding the structural change of emerging and developing countries themselves. So let's start from the first point. It seems that there is a perverse relationship between underdeveloped productive structures and the economic consequences of COVID. Those countries presenting a relatively underdeveloped, countries or regions presenting a relatively underdeveloped productive structures are regions which suffered the most from COVID. The clear example are Latin America and South Asia. Why? First of all, because the distinguishing features of relatively underdeveloped productive structures are larger informal sectors, which imply no or lower protection against the effects of COVID, against the economic implication of COVID, such as lockdown. Those regions also present an heavier reliance on the so-called contact-intensive, low-skill industries, such as retail, transportation, hospitality, and it goes without saying that those have been the sectors affected the most by COVID in terms of lockdown, in terms of loss of income, of loss of possibilities of producing and selling their services or goods. I will move to the fourth point. The outbreak of COVID also led negative consequences, at least temporarily, for those countries highly dependent on natural resources, in particular the energy-related goods. It is true that the reduction in the price of primary commodities was temporary in the case of COVID. After COVID started, it is true, however, that the eruption of the pandemic stressed one more the exposure of those countries to the high volatility in the price of primary commodities. And we all know that the high volatility in the price of primary commodities is a major source of disruption and instability in developing and emerging economies. Final point, which is the third one reported in this slide. One problem is the lack of diversification towards high-tech manufactured goods, or alternatively, a perverse specialization in those manufacturing sectors which have been heavily affected by COVID. One example, for instance, is the automotive industries. Many Latin American countries, like Mexico, for instance, present a quite remarkable specialization in that type of medium high-tech manufactured goods, among the few manufactured goods which play a role in their productive structures. And unfortunately, it is precisely those manufactured sectors which have been highly affected by COVID. Differently with respect to others, like communication and IT technologies, in which even expanded during COVID. So all this tells us that productive development is fundamental to trigger off a sustained and sustainable post-COVID economy, and possibly to give rise to the sustainable transition towards the digital and green economy. Obviously, in order to engineer this transition, to make it sustainable, to make it sustained, to make the economies more resilient to these type of shocks in the future, it is first of all important to understand which are the sources of persistent productive underdevelopment. And here is the main topic we try to address in this paper. We want to analyze whether periods of large capital inflows could be considered as sources of permanent, persistent, productive underdevelopment. Better to say, whether periods of large capital inflows could be source of premature deindustrialization. For this reason, we will combine in this paper two streams of literatures. One, the literature on premature deindustrialization. One relevant contribution for our work has been published by Daniel Roderick in 2016, trying to measure premature deindustrialization in both developed and developing countries, but in particular in the case of emerging and developing countries, obviously. And the literature about the possible role of large periods of large capital inflows over the structural change, the structural composition of those economies receiving such larger capital inflows. And here I will say in a short while a little bit more about how our contribution is connected to previous contributions, such as those from Benigno and others in 2015 and even before 2014. Now, this is how, I mean, as I told you, our contribution takes inspiration from a previous contribution by Daniel Roderick, who tried to estimate, to measure premature deindustrialization through these econometric analysis. As you know, there is lots of contribution about what the natural trajectory of the industrial sector, of the manufacturing sector, more specifically in developing, emerging, and developed countries. Hypothetically, the manufacturing sector, or better shares of the manufacturing sector, either in terms of GDP, contribution to GDP, but also in terms of contribution to general employment, should follow a kind of inverted U-shaped curve. We would expect the share of manufacturing to increase at the early stages of economic development, reach a ceiling, and then start a declining path, the process of deindustrialization, when a relatively advanced economic system moved towards a more service-led economic system. So this is the natural structure, the expected structural development of the manufacturing contribution to the overall economy. Premature industrialization obviously takes place when the declining trend in the contribution of manufacturing to the whole economic system starts earlier or at the lower level of manufacturing contribution itself to the economy. Daniel Rodrik tried to estimate the contribution of the structural forces to the evolution of the industrial sector using this equation, and these are the structural components in his analysis. X is GDP per capita, X squared is the squared value of the GDP per capita, and using also population as another indicator of those structural forces guiding the process of industrialization first and industrialization later. And then Daniel Rodrik included some decade-specific dummy variables to measure whether in those decades, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and eventually in the 2000s, there were episodes of premature deindustrialization, whether the industrialization was stronger, tougher, and than expected, according to the structural forces identified before. The problem is that what Daniel Rodrik did is to, if you want, measure the industrialization without providing a clear explanation of the sources of premature deindustrialization itself, explaining what lies behind such a process of premature deindustrialization, even though from a theoretical point of view, many different theories and many different contributions mentioned some possible factors. Trade liberalization, the natural resource curves, international capital flows. International capital flows is precisely the factor we would like to pay attention to in this work. From a theoretical point of view, there are different channels through which international capital flows could be considered responsible for premature industrialization. One first channel is the so-called financial Dutch disease. The idea that periods of large capital inflows could cause the appreciation of the real exchange rate, and the appreciation of the real exchange rate could bring to the crowding out of domestic tradable sector, mainly manufacturing, vis-a-vis the non-tradable sector. This is a quite well-known story. And obviously, in this case, the financial Dutch disease is expected to play a negative effect of abundant capital inflows towards countries on the manufacturing sector contribution to the overall economy. Another effect that might be positive is the idea that in many cases, large capital inflows come together with an appreciation of the foreign exchange. And in the case of economies in which firms are mostly indebted in foreign currency, an appreciation of the foreign exchange make their balance sheet more solid and could incentivize firms to invest more. In this case, large capital inflows, together with the appreciation of the nominal exchange rate mainly, could have expansion and positive effect on manufacturing, in particular if this causes firms to invest more to upgrade their capitals, to improve their capital stocks, to renovate it, and become more efficient and potentially competitive. The problem is that positive effect mostly comes as an initial expansionary over-optimistic phase of a traditional Minskian cycle in which the expansionary phase comes first, Firms tend to expand their investments, firms tend to become more indebted, but then they become overly indebted. And they progressively move towards a speculative Ponzi position, in which then a possible reversal of the exchange rate, so after the initial appreciation, there is the depreciation of the exchange rate when it kicks off, give rise to the reversal of the cycle, firms that start to deleverage, and this most of the time brings to an exchange rate collapse, a financial crisis, and an overall economic system, an overall economic crisis. And most of the time, if we take the dynamics of the economy over the full cycle, the negative consequences are more pronounced than the positive one. A final element is related to how the surge in credit that most of the time comes together with surges in international capital inflows is allocated. There is kind of evidence, in some cases anecdotal evidence, according to which booms in international capital flows together with expansion in domestic credit are associated in the overexpansion of the non-tradable sector or some servicing sectors like the real estate. If so, but there is not enough evidence on this, and that's why the question mark. If so, anyway, if this is true, again, capital booms could easily bring to a process of premature industrialization, in the sense that the relevance of manufacturing tends to decline inside the overall economic system. This is a list of previous contributions in which there is some initial empirical evidence about the negative contribution of international capital flows to the productive development of the economy. Productive development of the economy here intended as the expansion of the manufacturing sector, and therefore there is initial evidence of international capital flows as triggers of premature industrialization. I want to mention in particular the contribution coming from Benigni and others, in which they find the negative link between surges in capital inflows and resources allocated to manufacturing. In this case, however, surges in capital inflows are captured just indirectly and are measured in the form of large current account deficit and accumulation of foreign reserves. So basically, they are using the standard accounting of the balance of payment and are taking a large current account deficit minus the variation in foreign reserves as mirroring the large financial account inflows, and therefore evidence of periods of financial booms. What we are doing right now is to develop further the Roderick analysis, and Benigni as well, in two ways. First of all, in terms with respect to Roderick, we focus on four variables, sorry. Three are taken from Roderick, and the third one is an add of our contribution. As Roderick does, we will investigate the evolution of the manufacturing nominal and real GDP shares. We will investigate the evolution of the manufacturing employment share. On top of these, we will investigate also the evolution of the economic complexity index as an additional factor, possibly measuring the productive and technological development of the economic system. So this is a plus with respect to what Daniel Roderick did in his analysis, on top of trying to find some sources of premature industrialization, rather than just verifying if there were cases of premature industrialization. With respect to Benigni, our contribution is to use direct data about some types of capital inflows. So we will not resort on using data about large current account deficit minus the variation in foreign reserves, which is just an indirect measure of capital flows. We will use direct data about non-FDI net financial inflows. So we will focus our attention on portfolio, investment, and international credit. Why this? Because these are the most volatile components of capital flows. Because these type of capital flows are usually the most disruptive one in terms of the macroeconomic stability of the economy. We would like to analyze whether those capital inflows, which are most of the time come in waves and are very volatile, might also be disruptive in terms of the long-term development of the productive dynamics of the economy. And also because they could easily be moved by different, motives with respect to FDI. And that's why we excluded the FDI from our analysis. Yeah.
We should conclude. We should.
Okay. So this is the regression analysis we included, in which we tried to capture these periods of abundant capital inflows with the creation of a dummy variable, plus other explanatory factor. I'm moving straight to the results. So the results in terms of manufacturing, the manufacturing employment share, as we can see, we have consistently negative results, in particular for emerging and developing countries. So negative contribution of periods of financial booms in terms of the manufacturing contribution to general employment. This is the same for the manufacturing value added share in nominal terms. In terms of the real manufacturing value added, the contribution is negative, albeit it is not significant. More relevantly, we find a negative relationship also with the economic complexity index. And more interestingly, this negative effect is recorded also in the case of developed economies. Before, as you saw, this negative effect is significant, in particular for the case of emerging and developing countries. In this case, we see also an effect in the case of developed economies. We also did a robustness check, not creating a dummy variable, but using straight data about capital inflows, and our results confirm what we have. So in this case, the sign is always negative, albeit not significant. But if we move to the other variables, the negative and significant coefficients emerge again. So overall, we could say that we can easily find, we found in our results a negative effect of periods of large capital inflows on all the 4 different indicators we used in order to assess the level of productive development of the economy. And therefore, we could say that periods of large capital inflows could effectively be taken as sources of premature deindustrialization. This brings us to the policy implication, and this effect, importantly, could be summarized in terms of economic significance in a 3-4% less of manufacturing sector contribution to either employment or GDP in nominal or real terms, and also in the value of the economic complexity index. There's the final part related to the policy implication, but I think I could stop here and we can then move back to the presentation and the policy implication in the general Q&A question, if this is fine by you. Marwil?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. We are ready to collect. We are already collecting questions from the audience. If the audience has any clarification, any question you'd like to ask, right now is the moment for Alberto. Otherwise, we move for the other presentations. But if you still have a question for Alberto's presentation or in the other presentation, you can still write in the chat. And at the end of all presentations, we can try to make a sum up. So I do have something to ask Alberto. First of all, thank you for very interesting presentation, very interesting results extending this framework that started with Roderick 2016 and so on and so forth. I was wondering 2 things. So you put all emerging countries together, if I understood correctly, in your regression. And then this literature, this structural literature, it has explored important differences in the industrialization and deindustrialization between at least 2 main regions. South America comes to my mind, and Asia, right? So I was wondering if maybe you should expect, or you might have different effects if I look at just to Asia and then just to Latin America. So that's one thing. And then if you allow me a second clarification, Roderick, if I remember correctly, that paper by Roderick on the industrialization, he shows that he plots the inverted U shape and relationship, and he shows this inverted U shape is changing over time. So that's where premature deindustrialization kind of comes from. It's becoming more and more in early stages of development. So I was wondering if a similar effect could happen to this negative effect that you find, if this effect is changing, this negative effect from finance or some measure of capital flows to manufacturing, if this effect is changing also over time. Thank you.
Should I reply to these questions?
So we don't have yet questions from the audience.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so now thank you for this question. They're very interesting. In terms of the first point, you are definitively right. There are differences among different set of countries, of emerging and developing countries. At the level of, and actually, I had to say that we will introduce some more detailed regional analysis in a revised version of the paper. This is one of the comments we received from the referees of the journal to which we send the paper. Now, from the purely econometric point of view, the problem is that when we try to disentangle the analysis at regional level, since that we want to use direct financial variables, there is a lack of enough data. So in some cases, our results remain of the same sign, but they lose significance. Okay. And because there are no enough observations. And this is something that happened also to Roderick and other analyses that tried to go that way. So when they tried to split their analysis in different regions, from a purely econometric point of view, there is a problem of lack of enough observation. In any case, in a revised version of the paper, we will provide more evidence about these differences at the regional level, disentangling East Asian countries, Latin American and African ones, East Asian countries, including or not China. So if you want, this is an anticipation of our next development. There is, if you want, descriptive evidence, in the sense that if you look at some descriptive evidence, if you take, for instance, the manufacturing employment share, it's clear that in the case of Latin American countries, they are all going in a downward-oriented trend, and they present a negative manufacturing employment share gap. So in the sense that right now, the contribution of manufacturing to employment is lower than what would have been expected according to their level of development. So this is the manufacturing employment gap.
For South America.
For South America. So the contribution of manufacturing to employment is lower than what would have been expected. And this negative value is exacerbated during period of financial booms. This is the contrary with respect to East Asian countries. In East Asian countries, they generally present a positive manufacturing employment gap. So the share of manufacturing employment is generally higher than what we would expect by looking at the structural factors included in our regression. Second point, you're remembering very right the Roderick paper. In fact, we could hypothetically reproduce the same dynamics in the sense that we have the structural variables included in our regression, showing which should be the hypothetical U-shaped, inverted U-shaped dynamics of the manufacturing employment share or manufacturing GDP share. And then we include the financial dummy variable, which is not a period dummy variable as Roderick did, but it is a real explanatory factor. Since that it is associated to a negative coefficient, it means that dummy variable moves toward those trajectories. And effectively, we could reproduce, from a visual point of view, what Daniel Roderick found and showed in his paper, adding a piece of explanation. So what caused in different periods such process of deindustrialization? We are claiming that in some, periods of financial bonanza, periods of large capital inflows contributed to this process of premature industrialization.
No, thank you very much. Your answers were very clear, and thank you for such an interesting paper, such an interesting research agenda. I think we can move on. If you still have questions for Alberto, if our friends that are following us on YouTube have questions for Alberto, don't hesitate to write it. And at the end of everything, we can still try to sum up and try to provide some answers. So thank you, Alberto. And now we continue with our next presentation. We have from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Ledson. Are you with us, Ledson? Can you share your slides with us? He will present the stock flow consistent approach of Sraffian Supermultiplier with inventories. So the floor is yours. Ledson, 20 to 25 minutes. I will let you know when your time is finishing. We cannot hear you. I think you're muted. No, we don't hear you. I don't hear you, at least. No, I don't hear you. I was hearing you before Alberto's presentation, but now I don't. And now I'm alone. So we're having some minor technical issues, which happens even after a couple of years of pandemic. This happens. And Ledson is back with us.
Sorry, but now you can hear me.
I hear you perfectly. Could you please share your slides so we can start your presentation?
I don't see the option for sharing.
So there is a button share with a plus.
I can see here.
Next to mute, stop can, settings, and there is share.
Stop, microphone, camera. No, because I have a problem with my computer. I on the tablets. I access on web browser, but don't have the option. Have a problem. I can share for you and you present for me.
Yes, definitely. If you give me your slides, I could share your slides.
Please share with me your email, please. Sorry, guys, and I'm a fault.
Fine.
One moment,
so if you send me your slides, I can.
One moment. I sent to you.
Okay, thank you. I just received them, and
Does receive now? Does receive something?
they're downloading it.
But you hear me now, okay? It's fine.
Yeah, I just received it, and now I'm trying to open. But it's not open. Okay. Fantastic. So I have it, and now we are going to share.
Stream Awards is very good, but have some problem. But share the content sometimes. So.
Yes, we have. So Windows. So I will try to. Yes, here we have share. Can you guys see the presentation?
Yes,
Can
I
you
can
see the
see.
presentation? Ledson.
You can hear me.
So you tell me when you want me to slide.
Okay,
I can hear
okay.
you, yes.
Thank you very much. So now I'm now reintroduce me. I'm Ledson. I'm a course in PhD in Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and my work is stock flow consistent approach of Saffrian multiplier with inventories. The next, please. Well, I have technical problems for my part. I like present the overview of my work. So before the metrics, I think is very nice. Speak about my inclination, my particular inclination for speak this time. It's about the question in most model, SFC model, no have inventories or stocks linked to the product. It's a it's a problematic because the convergence of the convergence of the short term is required without the perfect provision needs a stock adjustment, and in the long term uh, equilibrium or steady state is better speaking in terms of steady state. On the long term, the stocks represent a very important paper in dynamic because the stocks in the dynamic of supermultiplier is very important for normalize the capacity. Uh, inter periods at the steady state, and the pressure of the capacity is not so intense without the situation what don't have stocks. So stocks is very interesting and very useful for understand the dynamic in short periods and the long periods. So this is the main matrix of the relations in the model. It's the main relations, but it's interesting appoint some features. Is the paper of the inventory maintenance, is the pay for the firms for the banks. It's a characterism of the maintain stocks is have a cost related of these stocks. So this is incorporates of the model because the pay of the rate tax about the stock of inventories. It's a particularly it's how say it's a manner for present schools sorry, present this cost for simplification because have very difficult in at now present of the other forms. So other interesting is the firm profits. No, it's interesting, but not now. It's the relation of the families having autonomous consumption from the welfare, and the inventory chains have counterpart. I don't know, but in so current in the firms and the capital, but is a equilibrium. It's a necessary relation between the balance of the firm for have a stock flow consistency in the macro view. Next, please. Next. Thanks. It's the main equations of this model. It's pi. It's the participation of the one moment, please. Pi is the participation of the capital gains in the product. Have it so it's a function of a collective parameters. The variation of it is the description of how the adjust level of capacity work in the long the time is give for the expression, but have margin for not a idiosyncrasy, but is a very simplification related with the form with the capitalism. Sorry, it's a realistic interpretation about how the capitalism modifies the utilization degree in the nearly of the natural degree of the utilization. It's the adjust. It's not a point, but in the neighborhood of the natural rate. In the view of the firm, the product is the planned product is given for the expression here. You have it's a iota d is the central variable. It's a ratio sales inventory. Inventory sales. It's have in mind the capitalism for the product firms is expectation of sales is only an adaptive expectation of before periods and whole inventory at the last period. In the macro level, have these expressions of the inventories only a buffer from the gap between the products and the sales in its period. Next, please. Sorry, have a mistake, but this is a presentation of the main results of the model because have some stylized facts between the stocks and the stocks and the products. Please give a zoom in the image. Next, please. Next. Zoom, please. Okay, fine. The first observation, it's about the movement of the stocks and sale. This I have because the statistical observation have between bonds for 0.18 and 0.22. This is the boundary of this relation of the historical observation in some nations. So the model simulates this in this boundary. And the relation of variation of inventories by products is nearly by zero. It's because the relation of the administration structure of production just in time in the economies. It's dialogue of the stylized facts, the modelation, the results of the model. Please. This is another, of course, typical fact about these inventories is the procyclical movement. Sorry, the comparison between inventories and the product have in the same direction, but that at the past grow the growth rates of inventories have uh, one period move one period before the great rates of the product. It's before the adaptive characteristic of the model. Please, the next. This is like velocity of convergence of the model. This is very terrible in this image, but having a comparative view between my model and the model of the reference Broche and Silva 2010, 2029. Well, the convergence of the my model is very most quickly for the other model because the have emergency property is the adjust most quickly with inventories of the utilization degree. So it's most emergency property very interesting, expected, but have a confirm this property. Please, the next comparison. This is this is facilitate facts and what I presented. But now I speak. Sorry, have a problem of the ordering of the row of the slides. But now I speak about the shock in the model. The shock related the expectation of the related to sales inventories in the model. They have positive incentive, the capitalism for have a most bigger propensity to the expands the propensity to inventory sales in the model because the capitalism desired most inventories for the future fluctuation of demand. So this is sorry guys, but this results is have a variation of the sales under products in first moments on variation positive because the induced and the autonomous components of the consuming the variation of the sales boosts the shared profits of the firms, so having additive on your health and the posterior movements, and have impacts of the product growth product because the desire of the capitalism produce more inventory for compose the new relation, because the movement of the demand, the sales, have an impact of thanks. The next have impact in the governance. And B, it's a relation of bonds rate and capital of the government. Have decline of the bonds because the bonds function of the product, but the product have an apotheosis in the first moment. In the second moment, have a decline. So the financial of the governance reduce between the tax of the consumers and your partner of the your partner of the your your pattern of the your consume. Sorry, the central relations in this the value of the assets of the firm have movement equal of the test the rates of capital grow. Please for the other slides. Uh-huh. This ah okay. Stock and property come back please. With a variation of the properties of the modification properties of the health have of course a decline of the ratio of health by capital stock in the families. The investments have the grow, but L is a lowest rate lowest and capital stock is normalized. All the variables normalized by capital stock. The lowest of the firm is crazy because the loss of the firm increase because the one moment please this line chocolate no sorry it's the last result please forward okay now yes the wealth the families decline of course the lowest of the firm decline before increase because the in the first moments the families spend more but the firms share most loans share most profits for the families and the these families one moment these families have a potential of the your your consume in the first moment but decline in the other moment because the total wealth decline so the firms produce more because the adaptive expectative have a delay from the expectation of products in the other times and the firms accumulate stocks and because accumulate stocks the amount of the necessity for pay these stocks they maintain these stocks increase and so if imply the necessary for new loans for financing the increased cost of the stocks the value of the equities of the firms decline of course because the most lending this firm necessary for maintain your course and before the change of portfolio choice of the consumers of the families. Next, please. This is a relation of utilization degree. Expect the increase in the first moment, but converge for nearly the neighborhood of normal degree. Z the autonomous autonomous demand not related with the product. You have first moments the nearly movement of the related of the wealth. So have increase in the first month, but the change of the firms because wrong expectation of the sales in maintain in the high level is the first state, and the families reduce your consumption because the profits distributed for the firms reduce. So the autonomous consumption reduce too. Next, please.
You're running out of time. So
Sorry.
you should conclude soon. So keep in mind.
The next, please. The next slide. Is the last?
Yes, that is the last.
Okay. So conclude now. Well, the model have a graceful presents the main stylized facts in the literature, the principal emergent properties was present in the model. The next steps is a very basic model, but the next steps include these notions and these results in a model have a most complexity with a multi-sector model and other extensions. Is this? And sorry because I at the last night I don't sleep very well. I'm traveling, so I'm terrible for this presentation. But thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much, sirs.
No, thank you for your presentation, for the model you developed, bringing new insights, interesting insights on the role of inventories in this framework, right? Developed by or started by the Sraffian Supermultiplier, Serrano and Freitas, 2015, right? In the review of political economy. So again, for our friends that are following us on YouTube, feel free to write your questions, to share your questions to the author on the chat. I have a couple of my own, so I would like to ask you the following. I was wondering if first in the beginning of your presentation you presented one of your equations was the behavior of the share of investment in output, right? So and this in the formulation you use is different from Freitas and Serrano. You introduce a nonlinearity, right? So you have the variation of age is equal to age in the previous period that multiplies the deviation from the standard deviation to the normal rate only when this difference is greater than R. Otherwise, you have zero. So you have a nonlinearity there. I was wondering if you could motivate why you didn't follow the traditional Serrano, and if this is related to the fact that you are introducing inventory in the model.
In the first moments, no having is clear relation between one factor and the other because the capitalism of the system don't converge necessarily for the natural grids of utilization in the steady state of the model is give the model most realistic approach because the Macedo Silva speak about this and the other post nations, but the idea is the capitalism not just for exact points of the degree of utilization because the cost of this in the best words the marginal adjust not it's not necessary. Okay. The adjust for the neighborhood is the great for this capitalism, but with inventories it is have feedback relation because if have disruptive movements like change the relation of the inventory sales for the capitalism or other disturbance in the model. The convergence is very most simple with this this assume this adjust for their neighborhood, but not the points. So this is the motivation. Sorry.
Thank you, thank you. Alberto, I don't know if Alberto has questions. Also, feel free to intervene and to ask if you have something in mind. Otherwise, I have a second one, if you allow me. Again, among your results, one of them was the convergence to the level of capacity utilization to the normal level, right? And you compare your results with the results of Brochure and
Silver.
Esatto. And there is a significant difference between your results and their results, because you show that the capacity utilization overshoots over the normal and then converges from above, while their results, it undershoots. You have capacity utilization going downwards and then converging from below. I was wondering if you have some comments on why is this happening in the model?
Well, this is I think this is because the first place have one question about the initial values. I think the initial values is the most nearly, but I have no the most set of the equation between the nature of the investigation of the Brochure and et al. Is different, but the main difference is between the adaptive the planet production is have adaptive movements. So have year of the expectation, you have in first periods have a positive error of the expectations. So have is have a pressure of the utilization capacity, but I have an overshoot because the positive error of the expectations. But the Russian and et al. Not have this, have like perfect provision in the model. So have downgrade of the utilization of capacity, but the induced one moment please, the elements are induced like the investments and the consume after the not induced autonomous but have respected dynamics is the wealth have a path which have a up down. So this is the main difference, but I don't reflect most because because this nature of the divergent result. But I think is the main difference between the expectation of the planetary the production.
Okay, thank you very much. Alberto, do you have questions?
No, I don't have any specific question. Thank you for the presentation, by the way.
Otherwise, Alberto, I will ask you to become the boss of the session and to control my time, because now I will present my paper, and please be very rigorous with the time.
Okay,
I will try to share.
Let me take my phone such that I know precisely how much time you are left with,
and thank you to all of you that are following our ordinary session E of this second international workshop on structural development macroeconomics, organized by the Structural Development Macroeconomics Research Group. The main topic of the session is the structural change, export-led growth, and the Sraffian multiplier. So Alberto is back with us. I'm going to share my slides and show screen. Sure. Can you see my slides?
Now, yes.
Yes, fantastic. So
Perfect.
again, thank you very much for having me today. The title of my presentation is A Song of Ice and Fire: Competitiveness in an Export-Led Growing Economy. And here the title was an attempt to make a reference to a well-known TV show, at least for 10 years. This TV show stole 10 years of my life, Game of Thrones. I'm a big fan. The paper is currently under review. The reviewers gently ask us to remove reference to the TV show. So the final version of the paper will not have any reference to ice or fire. But for the moment, this is the preliminary title, and this is a work, a joint work with my dear friend José Oreiro from the University of Brasilia. Now, the relationship between growth and the real exchange rate has been subject of a lot of interest of development and macroeconomies over time, especially the correspondence between the real exchange rate and processes of catching up and falling behind. Now, the existing empirical evidence, and this is our reading of the existing empirical evidence, making reference to reviews of the literature, Rapetti, Demir and Rasmi, the Journal of Economic Service, is that you have mainly two effects here, right? A positive association between a more depreciated real exchange rating levels and growth. So a more depreciating real exchange rate related to higher growth, but currency depreciations. So depreciations have negative effects on growth. So depreciations have adverse effects on growth. And these two elements have been separately incorporated into demand-led growth theory. So we have demand-led growth theories that deal with each one of these mechanisms separately. And our reading of the literature is that a comprehensive assessment of the dynamic interaction between them is still missing. So what we try to do here in this paper is to provide what we consider to be a novel representation of dynamic cumulative causation that takes into account the interaction between goods and labor markets, the interplay between price and non-price competitiveness, taking into account these two effects. A more depreciating exchange rating levels has a positive impact on growth, but a depreciation in itself, the depreciations are recessive in nature. So our contribution in the paper, we arrived to a three-dimensional nonlinear dynamical system, and we showed that in equilibrium, the real exchange rate and the capacity of the productive structure to respond to changes in foreign demand are simultaneously determined. So price and non-price competitiveness in the model are simultaneously determined. A more depreciated exchange rate and higher non-price competitiveness are related to higher growth, but depreciation will have always an adverse effect on growth. We show the model is compatible with persistent and bounded fluctuations, conditional to the intensity of distributive conflict. And these fluctuations should not be interpreted as business cycles. So everything that is happening, all mechanisms that are happening in the model concern the long run. So these transformations, these cycles in the rate of participation, in price and non-price competitiveness, we interpret these cycles, these persistent fluctuations, as long-term phenomena. So we refer to them in the paper as long-run cycles of structural. The model has a destabilizing force from the goods market and a stabilizing mechanism from the labor market, and is exactly the interaction between these two forces that results in the long-run cycles of structural change. Now, this paper relates to an existing literature, and we try to contribute to different strands of this literature on cumulative causation. The starting point is we refer to them as the static models of cumulative causation. And in which sense these models are static? Of course, starting with Dixon and Tyrrell, 1975, they are static in the sense that you have a unique stable attractor, right? Normally, you don't have a labor market, and you have a unique stable attractor. So the economy converges at most you study deviations from equilibrium. So in that sense, those models are static. You also have, and you try to contribute to the literature, multisectoral approaches to cumulative causation. We make reference here to Araujo and others. The limitation maybe of these studies is that they are very good to capture the multisectoral dimension, and this is a limitation of our study. We work with an aggregate model, but in these multisectoral Passinetian approaches, out of equilibrium dynamics depend on stochastic shocks. So the model doesn't generate a persistent and endogenous change. Out of equilibrium dynamics depend on stochastic shocks, and this is an innovative flavor of our framework because we have endogenous, endogeneity in structural change in the model. We relate to a literature on dynamic cumulative causation. Of course, we are not the first to refer to dynamic cumulative causation. We have here Pugno in structural change in economic dynamics and others. They do have these endogenous cycles, but they make no reference, to the best of our knowledge, to non-price competitiveness. So they are always referring to price, or they seem to be more concerned with price or cost competitiveness. We bring this new element of non-price competitiveness. So we have a dynamic cumulative causation approach. We have interaction between labor and goods market, interaction between price and non-price competitiveness, and levels and depreciations of the real exchange rate. These are strengths of our approach. The main limitation, and this is our reading of our own research, the main limitation is that we are constrained to an aggregate setup. So let me here briefly present the main elements of the model and some of our results. We suppose the world is divided in two regions: fire, the domestic economy; ice is the rest of the world. At the end of the day, our model belongs to a family of north-south models or central-periphery models. So the center or the north, usually you have the rest of the world or the ice region, and the periphery or the south is the fire region in our model, the domestic economy. We are assuming in the paper the perspective of the fire economy. Goods and services are assumed to be imperfect substitutes. To avoid the complications of dealing with financial flows, that was the main contribution of Alberto's paper some minutes ago, we will assume the nominal exchange rate is constant. So we will refer only to the real exchange rate. So the nominal exchange rate is supposed to be constant and equal to 1. And we have basically the model 5 main blocks of equations. So we have a price competitiveness block of equations, a non-price competitiveness dimension of the model. We will have demand conditions, supply conditions, and finally distributive conditions. So price competitiveness is theta, is basically the real exchange rate, is the ratio between price in the foreign country or price in ice and price in the domestic country, price in fire. And the main idea here is to, for a given quality, provide the lowest possible price, right? So higher theta, higher price competitiveness is associated with a low price in the fire economy, that is the domestic economy. Non-price competitiveness, on the other hand, is the ratio between an index, a quality index of the goods produced in the domestic economy versus in the foreign economy. And here the idea is that for a given price, firms are trying to provide the highest possible quality. So in the first case, for a given quality, the lowest possible price. The second case, for a given price, the highest possible quality. Therefore, when the quality index in the fire region increases, μF increases, this region gains non-price competitiveness. We further take into account, we include in the model, the fact that once a non-price advantage is gained, it's increasingly more difficult to enlarge the gap. And that's why, because if you are in the technological frontier, it's more difficult to expand the technological frontier. And quality is deeply associated with the idea of technology, right? High tech is associated with higher quality. So as you expand, if you increase quality or non-price competitiveness, it becomes more difficult to keep increasing, enlarging the gap. New technologies depend on the sum of past innovation breakthroughs, and capital stock consists of a complex web of interlocking patterns. And this justifies why an increase in non-price competitiveness, as non-price competitiveness increases, it becomes increasingly more difficult to maintain, to enlarge the gap further. Now, what about demand conditions? We already presented price and non-price conditions. What about demand conditions? We start from a simple identity. Output is consumption plus investment plus net exports minus the exchange rate and multiplies imports. We don't have government in this economy, so this economy is not government. And an innovation here is that exports depend on price and on income of the rest of the world. income of the rest of the world to the power of non-price competitiveness, right? Because if Z, that is the income of the rest of the world, increases, domestic economy will be able to increase output, increase exports only if it has a certain level of non-price competitiveness. But we also have a price effect. But the novelty of the price effect here is that it doesn't matter your real exchange rate in a given period of time, in a given moment in time. What you need is the exchange rate over a certain time horizon, because a certain time horizon allows your domestic firms to plan and to enter foreign markets. So the price effect on exports is not the real exchange rate on a moment of time that matters, but is the real exchange rate over a period of time. And for simplification, we assume in the model that the relevant time horizon is from the beginning of history until nowadays. So a real exchange rate matters if a depreciated real exchange rate matters for exports only if you're able to maintain it for a certain period. So when you do some algebraical manipulations with these previous equations, it's possible to show, we show in the paper, that the rate of growth of output at the end of the day is equal to a non-price competitiveness that multiplies the rate of growth of the rest of the world, plus the level of the exchange rate minus the variation of the exchange rate. And this is an important result because equation 7 is capturing exactly these two mechanisms. A more depreciated exchange rate has a positive impact of growth, but depreciations have a negative. And of course, in the long run, you will have equilibrium. In the balance of payments, we arrive to Tirol's law, when the rate of growth compatible with equilibrium in the balance of payments is equal to a non-price competitiveness component plus a price competitiveness component. Supply conditions, we introduce supply conditions with a very simple Leontief production technology. When production depends on capital and labor, Q is the rate of growth of labor productivity, E is the participation or the employment rate, and N is your total labor force. Manipulating the Leontief production function, we have the dynamic Leontief efficiency conditions. Variations in the participation rate are equal to the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity and the labor force. And in equilibria, a constant participation rate implies that the rate of growth of output is equal to the natural rate of growth, right? The rate of growth of labor productivity plus the rate of growth of the labor force that is supposed to be exogenous in the model. And to keep the model as simple as possible, this is a simplification. We have that capital accumulation just mirrors the rate of growth of output. So the capital output ratio is constant. This is also a limitation of the model, and further future extensions could make this part, the capital accumulation part, more realistic. Now, again, to maintain the dimensionality of the system relatively small, we have that the wage share, or the rate wage share, is assumed to be just proportional to the employment rate. And why is this? Because a higher employment rate is associated with higher bargaining power of workers. So as the bargaining power of workers increase, they are able to get increasing real wages above labor productivity, thus increasing the wage share. We maintain prices in the rest of the world constant, but prices in the domestic economy are a positive function of the wage share. Why? Because firms, when the wage share increases, it means that labor costs are increasing. So firms might choose to respond by increasing their prices. So firms in the domestic economy might respond to an increase in the wage share by increasing their prices. But that doesn't have to be necessarily the case. They also might increase their search from labor-saving production techniques. And that's equation 14. So in equation 14, we have that labor productivity depends on cumulative causation, because we have dynamic economies of scale. An increase in the rate of growth, on the long run rate of growth of the economy, increases the rate of growth of labor productivity, but it also depends on the participation rate. And why is this? Because as the employment rate, as the participation rate increases, this increases the bargaining power of workers, and then firms might respond to this. If they decide not to increase prices, they might increase their search for labor-saving production techniques, in this way increasing the rate of growth of labor productivity. That's equation 14. And finally, in the equation 13, what it's telling us is that we have a bridge, a structural change bridge, if you want, from price to non-price competitiveness. So if you are able to sustain price competitiveness for a certain level of time, then you are able to learn and translate this into non-price competitiveness. We can think here is the example of China, that in the beginning was producing cars of very low quality, but maintain a more competitive exchange rate for a certain period of time. They learn how to do better cars. And now they produce cars that are in the technological frontier. So this is the idea of equation 13 to capture this bridge between price and non-price competitiveness. So after a series of algebraical manipulations, we arrive to our dynamic system. It's a three-dimensional one with the following equilibrium conditions as in 16. And it's possible to demonstrate certain properties. So the system has a unique internal equilibrium solution that is defined by the following expressions. And notice the last expression, rho and theta. Rho is non-price competitiveness, theta is price competitiveness. That price and non-price competitiveness are determined together, and they are positively related in equilibrium. Now, this equilibrium point is going to be stable. This unique internal equilibrium solution is stable as long as that very ugly inequality is satisfied. So if that inequality is satisfied, the equilibrium point is stable. But of course, that ugly inequality doesn't have to be necessarily satisfied. And if a change in one of the parameters makes this inequality not to hold, then a whole bifurcation might occur, and the system admits a family of periodic solutions. So we proceed in the paper by studying how realistic are these periodic solutions to emerge. We're not calibrating here a particular economy, or the Brazilian economy, or the South Korean economy. We're providing a general framework using parameter values that can be found in the literature. And in the paper, we try to be as specific as possible where our parameter values are coming from. So what we have here is our two-dimensional bifurcation diagrams. In the graph of the left, we have in the horizontal axis phi that is capturing the strength of distributive conflict, and in the vertical axis we have kappa. Kappa is capturing the magnitude of the dynamic economies of scale. So the magnitude of dynamic economies of scale going from 0 to 0.75, that's what we find in the literature, and the strength of distributive conflict going between 0 and 1.25. And what we find is that there is a significant region. The whole bifurcation is a dot line. So all the yellow color shows a combination of these two parameters for which you have periodic solutions. You have structural cycles of endogenous cycles of a structural chain. And we interpret this diagram showing us that these cycles are not merely a mathematical curiosity. They are very likely to emerge. So if we have enough distributive conflict and a relatively and standard dynamic cumulative causation with a kappa between 0.5, 0.4, we're able to have these periodic fluctuations. A similar result follows in the graph on the right. We have again in the horizontal axis distributive conflict, and in the vertical axis the coefficient that captures the bridge between price and non-price competitiveness. So how sensitive is non-price competitiveness to price conditions? And we find that if distributive conflict is sufficiently strong for any variable
Marwil, you're left with 2 minutes.
2 minutes is what I need. The periodic fluctuations emerge. Thank you, Alberto. So we prove in the paper, we demonstrate numerically that we're dealing with a supercritical whole bifurcation. So when one parameter ultrapasses the critical value, we have the emergence of the cycle, and higher dynamic economies of scale. So a higher kappa is associated with a small orbit. Higher kappa, higher dynamic economies of scale is related with lower volatility. Lower distributive conflict is also related to lower volatility. And if we compare the experience in the paper, we provide a discussion of Asia and Latin America. We see in Asia higher dynamic economies of scale and lower distributive conflict. And these countries are also have less volatility in comparison with South America. So we argue in the paper that the model reproduces some well-known stylized facts between these two regions. But notice that in these other two cases, you don't have change in the long run rate of growth. But if you increase the strength from price competitiveness to non-price competitiveness, you are able to increase the long run rate of growth. And here we think industrial policy plays a crucial role. This is something that Asia is doing very well and Latin America is not doing well, how to translate price to non-price competitiveness. Furthermore, we conclude showing mathematically how it's possible to obtain a representation of path dependence in the form of a chaotic attractor in such a way that different, very similar initial conditions lead to economic trajectories that are completely different. So for very similar initial conditions, the economies move together, but after some runs, the economies completely fall apart and have unique trajectories. And we interpret this as a representation of path effect. So to conclude, hopefully on time, the model provided on this paper provides a dynamic representation of cumulative causation, allowing the interplay between these two dimensions, right? Between these two dimensions of competitiveness, price and non-price competitiveness, and allowing for interaction between the labor and the goods market. We applied the existence part of the whole bifurcation theorem, and we showed that these endogenous cycles that are not business cycles, these endogenous cycles of structural change, are likely to arise. Cycles in the participation rate, in price competitiveness, in non-price competitiveness, in capital accumulation, because all these variables are changing in a phenomenon that we interpret is happening in the long run. A combination of a strong response of income distribution to the rate of employment with a low Calder-Verdun coefficient increases the system volatility. And we provided in the paper a comparison between the Latin American experience, the Asian experience, and the results in the model. So that's all. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you a lot, Marwil. Precisely on time. 1 minute late. Okay, but that's absolutely.
So I apologize for that minute.
No, that's absolutely fine. Perfect. So I will open the floor for discussion. I don't know if there is. I think there are 2 comments. So there are comments from Robert Blecker. I don't know if you can read yourself the question, Marwil. Otherwise, I will read them for you.
No, I have access to the questions.
Okay,
Professor
perfect.
Blecker is asking if I can intuitively explain how a depreciated level of the real exchange rate can be good for growth, but a move of the real exchange rate in that direction is bad for growth. Yes. So thank you very much, Professor Blecker, for this first point. I see that you have a second question, and I will try to reply to that as well. So intuitively, what is happening here is that because in the demand identity, that is our starting point, output depends on consumption plus investment plus exports minus the exchange rate that multiplies imports. The immediate effect of a depreciation is a reduction on output, so it's a reduction in the rate of growth. So that's what is driving the result, that the real exchange rate depreciation reduces the rate of growth. What is driving the result that a more depreciated exchange rate is related to higher growth is that a more depreciated exchange rate, if sustained over a sufficiently long period of time, you have 2 mechanisms playing a role here. First, that firms are able to plan their incursion in foreign markets, and therefore they are able to increase exports. And second, they are able to learn by exporting. So as firms are learning how to buy. Ledson, could you mute your microphone? Okay. So as firms are exporting, they are learning by exporting, and therefore they are able to increase non-price competitiveness. As they increase non-price competitiveness, they are able to respond better to changes in foreign demand. And this allows to increase in the rate of growth, in the long run rate of growth of the economy. So these are intuitively the 2 mechanisms in the model. And Professor Blecker has a second question. Is it a long run versus short run different? So if the lower real exchange rate is maintained for a long time, then the positive effects emerge. Or what is the intuition of this distinction? So we try to interpret our results as everything is happening in the long run, because everything is happening kind of is related to structural change. So we are trying to avoid focusing on business cycle effects. We don't interpret our results as business cycle effects. So, but what we say is that the real exchange rate, usually in the exports function, we think T-roll 79, you have the exports depend on price. So exports in T depend on price in T and demand of the foreign country in T. So if you have this exports function, a depreciation must have a positive impact on exports and therefore on the rate of growth of the economy. So what we consider is that we change this exports function. So it's not the price in T that matters for exports in T, but it's the price in T over a certain period, period of time. And this is what is making the positive result to emerge. I hope that answers the question. I don't know, Alberto, if for you the answer is more or less clear.
Yeah. From a personal point of view, it's absolutely fine and interesting in the sense that I have to say that I shared the same question with Robert. So good that you addressed these. I would like to know if there are other questions or comments. Otherwise, I have some questions myself, but I would prefer to leave the floor to the audience. If there is no any further question, I will step in and advance my question myself.
I think no.
Okay. No, I was wondering, connected to what Robert said and asked, whether it doesn't make more sense to include in your equations a negative effect of the volatility of the exchange rate rather than the depreciation of the exchange rate. Because what it seems to me is that what you're saying in a way is that I do agree, a level of a more depreciated exchange rate could be favorable because it gives firms more confidence that they could invest and possibly export because they are becoming more internationally competitive, whilst the fluctuation and variation of the exchange rate, at least in the short run, could be a little bit disruptive. Whether depreciation or the appreciation of the exchange rate are expansionary or contractionary, I think this is still a big question mark and depends on many factors. So I'm not so sure that a depreciation of the exchange rate is always contractionary. In some cases it might be, and obviously we well know long literature about the contractionary exchange rate depreciation, but I think this is a matter of empirical evidence more than theory. This is my first comment, and one more point. Funny stuff. I'm sharing myself today between the PKIS conference here in ES conference in London and this conference in Brazil. And before I listened to a presentation about if you want the technological gap between in that case between firms closer to the technological frontiers and firms following and trying to catch up. And in that case, there was something different with respect to what I guess it's included in your equation, in one of your equations, because you basically said the closer you are to the technological frontier, the harder it is to improve even further. Whilst if you are far away from the technological frontier, it is easier to catch up, right? Am I correct?
Yes.
They were suggesting precisely the opposite. And in fact, what you're saying is a kind of a thought with the idea of cumulative causation. So the more ahead you are, the easier could be, to some extent, to introduce novelties and further product innovation and achieve a better, a higher non-price competitiveness. In a way, this is consistent also with the literature about the product space. The more diversified you are, the easier it is to introduce new products, new type of products, new quality, higher qualities, and so on and so forth. So, and final point connected to these comments, if you are saying that industrial policy is important, this is precisely because it is not so easy to close the technological gap. Otherwise, if it is a kind of natural, or there are autonomous mechanisms leading to a sort of convergence in terms of technology and non-price competitiveness, someone could claim, well, then industrial policy is not so relevant. So I'm wondering whether you have also in mind some kind of different settings in that respect.
Okay.
Because I think that part is a kind of slippery, let's say.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And these are very, very relevant points. And this is an open agenda. So thank you for raising these points. And I hope to use them as this research agenda moves forward, right? So you raised 3 points. I will try to briefly assess each of them. The first one, if it doesn't make more sense to, instead of taking into account depreciations, to talk about volatility. And I completely agree with you. And I think the literature on exchange rates makes more reference to volatility than to, and you know this literature very well, than to depreciations per se. So yeah, we at this framework, we choose to work with the depreciation because we wanted to emphasize the difference between depreciating levels and depreciations. So that was from our initial starting point. And from a technical point of view, it's very convenient to model these two in a continuous time framework. So I do see an extension of this model in which instead of considering the depreciation, I consider the volatility, and I switch for a continuous time to a discrete time. So I see that as a possible extension. I'm trying to explain why we didn't do it, but I completely agree with your point that volatility might make more sense than a depreciation. The second point was about the technological gap and our assumption that as you get closer to the technological frontier, it's more difficult to change the technological frontier. And some of our colleagues in the post-Keynesian society argued the opposite. Once you get closer to the frontier, it might be actually easier to move forward the frontier. So my reading of the literature is that in the beginning, there is a lot of room for imitation. So if you are in early stages of development with very low non-price competitiveness, but very high price competitiveness, that was like the case of China, South Korea, 60 years ago, you can copy. You just copy Western TVs, radios, cars, and as you copy, you gain a lot in the beginning, but it then becomes more and more difficult. Can you hear me? I think I lost you.
We can hear you very well.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello?
Marwil, you can continue.
Hello?
Marwil, that's fine.
I lost you. I lost you guys. Hello?
Marwil? We can hear you very well.
Hello?
Marwil, please continue. Is there anyone who can get in contact with Marwil and tell him that we can still hear him very well? I think he is exiting the meeting and turning back. In the meanwhile, we are waiting for Marwil to come back. I'm wondering if there is any...
I'm back.
Marwil, you're back. Marwil, can you hear us? I don't think so.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. So please continue. Now you turned off your camera, however.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Please keep on going. Your camera is off, however. Marwil?
I think my connection is not very stable.
We can hear you very well. So if you want, you can continue and conclude, because I think we are over time of 5 minutes, more or less.
Okay, if you hear me, I will conclude my answer.
Yeah, perfectly.
No, I was basically saying that my reading is that when you're back, when you have low non-price competitiveness, you have a lot of space for copying. Once you get closer to the frontier, this space for copying becomes more difficult. And
Now we lost your voice. Marwil?
Yes, I'm here.
There. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Now it seems it works better. So please keep.
That was it. That was my reading of the literature. And as you get closer to the technological frontier, it's more difficult to copy. It's impossible to copy, and you have to move forward yourself. But I would say that I'm sure there are different dimensions of non-price competitiveness that matter. And some, as you get closer to the technological frontier, some of these dimensions, now that you have the tools, it's easier for you to use these tools and to continue moving on. And I think that is an interesting bridge with the economic complexity literature that explores these different dimensions of complexity and non-price competitiveness. So I definitely see a room for future expansions in the model, trying to differentiate between dimensions of non-price competitiveness, perhaps. I see that as a very relevant point. So thank you, Alberto, for raising it.
I mean, just a final comment on this. I think that if you think about a slightly revised version of those equations, you might have different parameters configuration leading to different results. So in some cases, cumulative causation prevails and the gap widens through time.
Yes.
With other parameters configuration, you might have a narrowing of the gap and finally a convergence. So this is something you could explore in
and you did mention in your comments and with this confusion with the connection, I didn't answer. You mentioned industrial policy, and I think industrial policy is very important. I completely agree that industrial policy is very important, and I do see industrial policy trying to influence the three crucial parameters of the model. So my reading of our results is that structural change will happen anyways. And these cycles of structural change, they are happening all the time. But what we need in terms of policy is how to calibrate these cycles. And the direction that I think we should go is to reduce distributive conflict, to smooth distributive conflict, to increase dynamic economies of scale, and to increase the learning processes from price to non-price competitiveness. Because increasing dynamic economies of scale and smoothing distributive conflict, you reduce the volatility, and increasing the bridge between price and non-price competitiveness, you are able to increase the long-run rate of growth. Thank you.
Perfect. I think that I will give you back the control of the chair of the session.
Okay. So guys, thank you very much. Thank you, Alberto, and Ledson for such interesting presentations. To our friends that follow us on YouTube, in particular to Professor Blacker for raising very important, very interesting points. And that's it. Let's continue with our event, with our discussions. It was a great pleasure having you guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Pleasure to meet.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.